Welcome to Model Minority Moms, where we talk about the meaning of success in career, family, and life. We are Jeanette Park,
Kate Wong, and Susan Liu,
Harvard classmates and Asian American working moms who get real about the pressures of fitting in while standing out. Hey, Model Minority Mom listeners, we wanted to put a call out there for you to consider becoming a paid subscriber to our Substack. That's currently the main way we're accepting listener support. And whether it's $5 a month, $10 a month, or a one-time annual subscription, will just put more fuel in our tank for us to keep on going, for us to be able to pay for a part-time editor, pay for our various editing software, pay for us to put out video content, do more on social media, just reach more listeners, moms and women and other people like us being the collective, not just the three of us, but our listener base as well. To be honest, we can't promise subscriber exclusive content. We're just going to be really real here. But some people have already really just donated without us even asking. And we thought maybe there's more people out there who would be interested if we put the call out. So, fellow model minority moms, we are putting out the beacon. Please respond.
Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Model Minority Moms. It is a dumpster fire out there, so what else can we do but run away from it all with escapist TV and media and books after our kids finally go to sleep and we get 30 minutes to ourselves to just run away. Today we have a guest on our show, the author Yiming Ma, to talk about his debut dystopian novel, These Memories Do Not Belong to Us. Born in Shanghai, he spent a decade in the tech and finance space in all the major metros, the fashion hubs like New York, London, Berlin, Johannesburg. And then his career took an interesting turn when he not only got his MBA from Stanford, but an MFA from the Warren Wilson School as well. His work has appeared in the New York Times and Guardian with numerous accolades to his name, and he was referred to us by one of our listeners. So as you are always listening to us, we are listening to you. So thanks for sliding into our DMs, listener out there. Yiming, welcome to the show.
Yay.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, what a great intro.
And book just came out yesterday as of this recording, so congratulations on that.
All right, Kate, kick it us with the first question.
Okay, I'm like the resident fiction book nerd here, and I've always loved fiction since I was a kid. And one of the things that I thought about immediately, Yiming, as I was reading through your book is that not as a comparison point, but as a reference point to the books by Asian American diaspora or Asian diaspora authors when we were growing up. So way back in the 90s. And so I thought of, like what I was reading then, Amy Tan, right? Or Maxine Hong Kingston. And I thought, what is really interesting about your novel and also a lot of the other novels coming from Chinese diaspora around the world today is that the reference points are so different. Like back then, what Amy Tan was writing to, absolutely no offense to her, she was a, groundbreaking author, was to a mostly Western audience with no understanding of Chinese history. That's where most of her novels were set, right, in China. Whereas when I read your book, and when I read books by other authors, I'm sure you probably heard of Shelley Parker Chan. I loved her fantasy books, R.F. Kuang, who is also really huge. You don't really, I don't know that it presupposes an understanding of East Asia, but the reference points are so different. And of course, your book, because it is, I guess, technically sci-fi, right? Or fantasy sci-fi genre blend is so different. And I kind of so I got really interested in thinking about, okay, so what kind of life did Yiming lead to this, this book? And so I kind of wanted us to start there to talk about your background, because I think it's very reflective of the kind of works that we're seeing come out today from our generation of Asian diaspora writers versus like 20, 30 years ago. So if you want to kick it off with just tell us about yourself, like your background, where you came from, your family, the immigration history, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So I was born in Shanghai towards the end of the 80s, so very much so in the same era as all of you. So I was born in Shanghai, but moved over to New York when I was fairly young, and then to Toronto But we didn't stop there. We actually went back to China and slingshotted between a bunch of these different countries. So I think I attended, 8 different schools before the 8th grade. And so there was a lot of upheaval. And my parents kind of just taught me that I needed to accept the rules of the land that we had gone into, whether that was, if things like racism happen, these are things not only you should anticipate, but that you should prepare for. And if things don't necessarily turn out the way you want to in at school or in your career, it's up to you to just work harder and figure it out. So that was kind of the context in which I grew up in, and books were really a refuge for me as I was going through that journey because they were kind of the consistent companions and meant so much to me. But I never really saw writing as a potential path, right, or a career of any sort. And I think that's what led me to have that, career in business and tech that's you mentioned, Susan. I worked in, finance consulting at McKinsey for a couple of years. I wanted to do something good for the world, so I did impact investing out of the UK, setting up affordable schools in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. But that was still within the context of trying to use capitalism for good. And it wasn't until, about 9 months before I started at Stanford that I decided to take some time to actually explore writing. It was something that was so important to me. I cared so much about the books growing up, but I never thought I could do it myself. And it just started small, just thinking about, what if I write an essay? What if I write a story? And one of the stories I ended up working on that year, 16, ended up winning this Guardian Fiction Prize about 2 years after that, and kind of gave me the confidence to keep going.
I'm curious if we can go back a little bit, Yiming, to you said you were a very avid reader of books, and I was too. And for me, they were also refuge. What made you think? Sorry, two-part question. What were you reading when you were growing up? Like, were you reading Asian diaspora writers, or mostly like the canon of the West, right? And then also, what made you feel like you couldn't write?
Honestly, growing up, I wasn't reading as much of the authors that you mentioned. I had to read them later on in my career. At first, it was just in some ways escapism. As you said, I read things like the Hardy Boys growing up. I read some sci-fi. I also watched a lot of TV shows and narratives through that lens. Instead of watching Sesame Street, my earliest television series were like wuxia, right? Like Chinese martial art dramas where the protagonists have special powers and can shoot energy out of their hands and
Kind of
fly
like
across
House of
mountains.
Flying Daggers, right? Just for the audience, if they kind of don't know the genre. House of Flying Daggers,
House of
Hero.
Flying
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Hero,
Yeah.
all of the Zhang Yimou kind of stuff. But back then it was television series from TVB, right? And it's a funny story, but a couple of years later I actually acted in one
What?
Hong Kong, yeah, in one
Ooh.
Hong Kong movie that was adapted from a big TVB series, and one of the co-stars was Charmaine Se, who played
Yeah. Oh
a
my gosh. Sorry,
big,
you get for the non C-drama
yeah,
nerds out there, dude, TVB is like the big maker of all, like a lot of C-dramas out of Hong Kong. And Charmaine Shi, she was in that really famous like drama that came out a few years ago, Empresses in the Palace, right? Yeah, in fact,
yeah,
that's her
and
most famous
like
role.
she played the main like the main heroine or villain, depending on how you see it, in The Heavenly Sword and The Dragon Saber, which was a show that just was one of my favorite wuxia. And then to meet her, like 15 years later, and she looks exactly the same. By the way, it was just surreal. So yeah, but that's what inspired me growing up. And then it wasn't until later on that I explored things like Philip Pullman's Golden Compass and so on. And they kind of informed, I guess, the beginnings of what These Memories Do Not Belong to Us became, right? Which is really, really different. It's set in a world where memories are bought and sold, and this reimagined China is kind of taken over. And as you said, Kate, just the context, the lens in which the stories are told are really, really different than probably what we read growing up from the Asian diasporic authors.
Hey, before we move on from your, understanding how you grew up, like I just want to understand, like, what led you to your family to move around so much? I mean, like, that's like not uncommon, but I feel like it is more than usually like Asian immigrants moving to the US.
Yeah, my dad actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. My dad first came over to do a master's in the early 90s by himself. And he partly did that because he couldn't afford to bring anyone else. The whole family had kind of pulled together money in order for him to come. And then a year later, my mom came in and joined him. So then I was raised by my grandparents for another year. And that's a whole abandonment story
Yeah, and
that's
that's
going on in
very
town.
typical, just for the audience who isn't
Yeah.
Chinese American, sadly. That is so many of our peers, right?
And you're an only
Yeah.
child, so it's just you.
Just me,
Okay.
yeah. Only child like most kids in my generation from China. And then I moved over a year after that when I was 5, along with a couple of my grandparents. But we couldn't stay for green card reasons. My dad had finished his master, had 1 year of this OPT visa, but wasn't able to find an employer that would take him. His English was also not the best, to be honest, at this time. And it was during a period where Canada allowed permanent residency as soon as you landed, if you had, the right
Oh.
points, the right education, the right background. And so we were like, are we going to stay illegally or are we going to try to move? And in the end, we decided to move. And that was not necessarily the obvious choice. Like we had a lot of family friends who actually did stay illegally and were eventually able to convert their legal status. But we ended up going to Canada. I still remember arriving on a train on a really, really cold winter day. And it was a struggle for my parents. I think they were working in restaurants. And that was also really hard because they had been university professors in Shanghai. And they were working in restaurants and they honestly weren't very well suited for it. Like they hadn't done hard labor before. So it was new to them. They weren't even as good as other people. And then they go to Toronto and they were looking for the same kind of jobs and they weren't finding them, right? Like it was hard. I think they eventually were at a restaurant working the dinner shifts only rather than the lunch shifts. There wasn't really a lunch at this Chinatown restaurant. And so it was just a really big challenge for them. And they decided to go back to China as a result, more like, okay, maybe it's a better place to raise our family. And so I went back into the public system and that was really, really interesting experience. My dad actually found a job at an investment fund instead of working at a restaurant. And we did that for, 6 months to a year. And I'm not entirely sure, honestly, to this day, what made them decide to come back. I think they were like, we worked so hard to leave. Do we need to give up this Canadian residency? And so my mom and I eventually returned to Toronto first, moved around between a couple of different friends' homes even while we were getting settled because no one would rent to us. Like my mom didn't have a job at that time. We couldn't demonstrate that we could pay the rent. And so we moved around a bit until eventually we settled in one of these apartment ghettos in Toronto. And then my dad eventually gave up that investment role and came back, took this strange job delivering phone cards to convenience stores back when you needed calling cards to call your families in other countries, and did that for many years while my mom retrained and went back to community college.
Your mom she retrained in, sorry, what was that?
Yeah, she retrained in actually computer science, but in community college. So something completely different than what she used to teach. And then I guess just to wrap this up, there was actually a period where she moved to Ottawa, which is 5 hours away from Toronto. And she, for her first job out of this community college, and she actually commuted back and forth almost every week
Wow.
on Thursday evenings and then Sundays on the Greyhound bus. And that's why my grandparents again moved over to help us out. So I didn't have my mom with me for most of my middle school, high school until I actually left for university.
Yeah, that's so crazy. And now as you're sharing more of your story, I'm like, oh, I kind of can see a little bit more of the tie-ins to your book. Just
Mm.
spoiler alert, there's phone cards in the book. And but it was also crazy that not only did you guys bounce between all these different countries and cultures, but also different levels of society, right? Like your parents were professors and they were researchers, and then they were here and they were really probably, it was hard for them to find a place to sustain themselves, right? And so they had to take all kinds of different jobs. And so, and I'm sure as their kid, you were that also affected you, right? And so, yeah, I feel like that's also kind of reflected in the book, and we'll get into that more.
I'm curious, even in terms of genres, right? Because you mentioned you started reading
Mm.
Philip Pullman. I think I've read a little bit of, but I'm not that familiar with the genre. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Well, Jeanette and I had a pre-recording chat with you, and I thought it was interesting
Mm.
when you discussed why you wanted to choose this setting, which is a futures dystopian setting for your writing, let's say, versus, not versus, but just like, why not, have something that's set like now or in the past, right? Not that there's anyone that's correct, but just curious why that was what you chose and why it's related to kind of like how you grew up or your interests in reading and your cultural identity exploration.
Yeah, I think I shared a lot just now about that tumultuous journey to kind of fit in the West. And I think part of that contributed to my decision to invent a new world. And it was a conversation I had recently with the Canadian Egyptian, now he's actually now American too, author Omar Al-Khan. And we talked, and I made a note about how interesting it was that our first novels were both speculative in nature, right? We're all kind of had a sci-fi element. His first book was American War, which imagines America after this Civil War. And he said maybe it wasn't such a coincidence. And maybe it was because both of us had been immigrants, had been somewhere else, and then kind of transported it into this West. And maybe we didn't feel necessarily that we had that authority to actually set our stories in the world, in present day America or Canada as it stood today. And I think that was very true for me. I think I didn't necessarily feel like confident that I could do that because this place didn't quite feel. I don't think I've ever lived in a place that felt truly like home. And so it's easier for me to imagine this new world and have the authority to write the stories in it. And I think you mentioned genre, like so the setting of the book is, the premise is that this unnamed narrator, the son, receives an inheritance of memories. And memories in this world are currencies or entertainment or education. And people have these mind banks which allow these memories to be transferred. And so he receives this inheritance of memories from his mother who has recently passed. And he realizes that a lot of them are actually banned, right? And they're actually illicit memories. And he has to decide what to do with them, whether to release them to the world. And these 11 memories are actually written in different styles, in different genres. And I think what gave me permission to write them that way, to explore all these different styles and genres, was the fact that I learned how differently people actually experienced memories, right? That it wasn't that not everyone experienced it the same way. Some of them very visually, some of them very auditorily. And I can go into this moment in which I really realized that. But my wife happens to be a memory researcher at a major Canadian university. I think all of that just contributed to giving me permission to make this book much bigger than I think it might have been otherwise.
So, did you write a short story that eventually led to this book? Is that right?
So 2 of the memory epics I had started were stories of the 11 I had actually started before, one of which had been published in The Guardian. But the actual genesis of the entire container of this structure actually probably came during the early days of COVID.
I see. And I think like it's always interesting. Like for me, I read the book before having spoken to you. I just know that you were referred to us by one of our listeners. And coming from my own background, my own perspective, you have like one view on what this book is about. But I think like, having the privilege of talking to the author, you can also ask the author directly, like for you, from your perspective, like what is this book about? What are like the major themes? Is there a message? Like, I think it would be, yeah, that's one question I wanted to ask you because I feel like if I didn't, it would be a waste of this opportunity.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, I wanted this book to be a refuge for others the way that other books were for me as well growing up. But I think very much so the reason why I built this speculative element of the mind bank and these memory transfers is so I could explore a world in which I could tackle these themes of, control, of collective memory and the importance of that. And also to look at that central tension that I felt growing up, which is that between survival and resistance in many ways. I came over to America and then Canada, I was kind of told that you just had to survive. I saw that through my parents. I never talked to my parents about any of this, by the way, too. Like whenever I had any issues, I never went to my parents for help. It was up to me to figure it out. It was up to me to figure out my career later on, which led to choices they didn't quite understand, including writing this book. But I think that was a big tension. And then as I kind of became a writer and met other writers, I realized there's a big responsibility as well to imagine what the system potentially could be, not just what it is today or what the current dominant economic system might be. And I think I still, to this day, struggle with that challenge of, when to speak up. I have an essay in the Globe and Mail about that coming up. And so those were themes I wanted to explore on one front. And then the other thing, which relates to what Kate said earlier on, this idea of, recontextualizing the world, right? Which was something a little bit different from the fiction that was written or best known in the 90s, was to reimagine a world in which, maybe the Asian characters could be seen from the lens of the majority rather than always from the minority, right? And it just gave me a freedom where I didn't have to explain necessarily these cultural norms that were just existent in my life and I believed in. But I felt like if I were trying to write solely for a Western audience, it would be different. And I think one reason for that is I am kind of this first generation immigrant, 1.5 generation. And most authors, even today, the first generation, they don't get to write these books, right? They have to get the jobs that I got at the beginning of my career. And it's often the second or third generation that has the chance to say, I want to be a writer. I want to tell stories. And often those stories are different than the ones from the first or 1.5 generation.
Yeah.
Does that make
No,
sense?
that totally makes sense. I once was having a conversation with a friend who is actually going to come out with her first book in a couple of months. And she was having a little bit of like the same tension around like, maybe I should just save it for later. And I was like, well, you can't write the book that you would write now later because you would be a different person later. And so I think there is a lot of truth to what you're saying. Yeah, about, yes, like there's an element of it where maybe future generations would be in a quote unquote better position to do something like this, but they also, their stories and what they want to say will be different from what you want to say.
And I think one thing too I've noticed in reading your book, Yiming, and also our, Daniel Tam Claiborne, me and Susan's friend who we interviewed recently for his debut novel, and some of these other authors that I've mentioned, is that there are these linguistic and cultural reference points within your book, Yiming, and these other books that are not self-explanatory. Like how I explain it, like for example, in your early stories, you refer to this country and you use the Chinese pinyin spelling, RIBEN, which any Chinese speaker knows immediately that's 日本, which is Japan, right? But if you didn't know that, you'd be like, what the heck is that? I think Jeanette went and Googled it, right? So I think it's really interesting that our generation writing today, I don't know if it's do you feel like it's you have the license, the right, the whatever it is to write this way? Because I feel like, even 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, people, not only the writers, but also the publishers, right, would have been like, well, you have to footnote this. And I don't know, maybe you will footnote it in your novel because we got the PDF version, right? So I'm just really curious. It's not a very clear question, but it's just, I want to get your thoughts on that, right? Like there are these linguistic and cultural touchstones that are not self-explanatory in a lot of the work that, like you and Daniel and other contemporary Asian diaspora authors are putting. What do you think of that? Why is that? Well, first of all, why is that? Why do you guys do it in your own words? And then how are the publishers and, readers receiving that, especially readers who don't have the reference points built in?
That's a great question. I think it's, there's a trend in which there is more license in order to be able to do these things. I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would have been more challenging. Like one example is that I've been seeing a lot more stories in which if you're using terms from another language, not just in Chinese, but any other language, you don't have to use italics anymore, right? It's just straight. And I think as I was writing there was a story, Chankanabe, where it's actually a sumo wrestler story, interspersed with recipes from his mother who's making this sumo stew. And when I first started writing that, I did actually use italics. And then my publishers were actually the ones who were saying, actually, I don't know if we need to do that anymore, right? And I think that was particularly interesting because if it had been in Chinese, I probably wouldn't have used italics. But because it wasn't quite my culture, I felt like maybe I needed to do that. And I've spent a lot of time in Japan over the years. I've worked in the sake company when I was out there. But even then, I wasn't quite sure. I think I went into this book with the attitude that I wanted to feel entitled to share, to just kind of assume the average reader knew what I knew and then go from there. If I needed to explain something, we'll find a way later. I'll let readers tell me, right? I had these advanced readers who read early copies. I had editors, I had agents. Let them tell me that they need it and let me make the decision otherwise. Now, that doesn't always happen, as in you don't always have the privilege to make the decisions, especially when you're selling a book. But I wanted to have the same kind of entitlement that if I were perhaps someone who was part of the dominant identity going into this, that they might have. And perhaps that's something that I brought from my time in business.
Yeah.
I see it. Yeah.
No, I think it's like it is part of, I feel like, a broader kind of thing that's happening in, minority authors, right? And I think that I first started thinking about this when I was reading Pachinko, right? I really enjoyed the book, but I think somewhere along the process of reading it, I kind of was like, this is interesting because this is a book written by a Korean American author in English, which is the language she's most fluent in, I think, but about an experience and story that doesn't take place at all in America or any Western country, right? And I feel like it's happening elsewhere too. Like, actually, this is a little bit of a more far-flung domain, but even in children's books, like I'm Korean American, and we have a couple of Korean American author books for kids, and it's very much like, just like, here are the words that we use in our house, and it's even written even more niche than that, which is like, it's a Korean American book, which is there's characters and they're using Konglish, which is like Korean and English mixed, and they're making Korean American jokes, right? Which is like puns based on Korean and English, right? And in the book itself, there's no explanation. You have to go to the back and look it up if you really need to, right? And so, but I think there is this kind of a little bit of like, it's almost like an attitude shift, right? Which is like, I am kind of explaining versus I don't know. This is, I guess, the way that I read it, which is like, I just really want to bring you into my experience, right? And I don't need to obviously explain to myself what these things are. This is just how it is. So yeah, those are just kind of, I don't know if that resonates or you have any tweaks on that, but yeah.
No, that definitely resonates. And I think the other piece is, yes, this book is written in English. The world doesn't have to always be so America-centered.
Yeah.
Either, right? Like, there's a lot of Asians out there, right? And so, the idea that everything has to be written necessarily for an American or Asian American audience, I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case. Again, I made certain decisions, like using the mind bank to imagine a world where the Qin Empire has taken over. That gave me more license to say, yes, of course, the lens has to be that the Asian traditions come first, right? Or the Qin or Chinese traditions have to come first. So I gave myself kind of buffer and something to do that. So maybe I'm not as brave as I may sound on this podcast, but I do feel like that allowed me to tell my stories more authentically and hopefully give an experience that will resonate more with readers.
Oh, Susan,
well,
go ahead.
I'm going to do a shift. Are you going to do a piggyback on that one, or are you going to go a shift?
Oh, no, I was just going to do some meta commentary.
Okay, you do meta
on that.
commentary.
Okay. I was just trying to think, like, in case, listeners want to orient themselves, what, if you're not a habitual reader of fiction, et cetera, what exactly are we talking about? I was just immediately thinking, like, let's say Twinkies, right? Like, if you're a American person talking about Twinkies, Americans all know what Twinkies are, right? But like, imagine if you were writing,
Wait,
like, if
I'm
you're an
sorry.
American
Wait.
person, you're writing.
I'm like thinking of twinks like gay men. Wait,
No,
what?
Twinkies
No,
like
twinks like the
the
food. The
like the
food.
little yellow sponge
Oh,
cake
Oh,
filled
yeah,
with cream.
yeah. But
Okay, maybe I'm dating
no,
us
I
because that's
know,
our 90s
I know what a
generation,
Twinkie is.
right?
I thought you were.
Cheetos. Fine. Let's just say Cheetos
Oh,
instead.
I
Okay,
thought you were gonna
Cheetos,
say like
Twinkie,
banana,
whatever.
like yellow on the outside, white
No,
on the
no,
and
no,
then I
no,
was
no.
like, so Twinkie is like tan on the
No,
outside. I was like,
just
are you talking
listen
about
to
these
what Kate's gonna
Jersey?
say.
Fine.
Okay, right? So like imagine if you like so I'm this is for the people who like maybe don't have the cultural reference, but imagine if every time you were writing a book or story, you had to explain what Twinkies were or Cheetos were. Does that make sense? It's sort of like this is the reverse of that, where I think what Yiming is saying is that we don't have to explain. Like instead of saying mooncake, maybe he writes the Chinese peeing, which is yibing. That's not in his, it's not in your book, Yiming, but I'm just kind of giving an example. I think why that's so powerful is that we don't have to explain ourselves for once. And I think, for example, the fiction of 20, 30 years ago, you had to explain everything. What's a kitchen god? Like even Amy Tan's, I remember that was one of my favorite novels of hers back in the kitchen god's wife. Well, what's a kitchen god? Like she had to translate that, right? And so I just feel like there's a certain powerful sense of reclaiming our identities as 1.5 generations, especially actually the last point where you and Jeanette made about being of, let's say, ex-immigrant origin, but choosing to write in English. Because when I think about like things, let's say, we're Chinese, Korean, and the Vietnamese. If you read something that's written in Vietnamese by a Vietnamese author, you're going to have a certain perspective about that. That's going to be about Vietnam and being Vietnamese, right? And if you're like a Caucasian person writing in English, that's going to be about one thing. But I think this power of being like Vietnamese American, right? Susan's also come out with a book, a memoir, and then Korean American and Chinese American, but choosing to write in English gives this really interesting nuance that I feel like only our generation can do. And I think that's really cool. Like I guess these thoughts have been floating around my head, but like the way that Jeanette and Yiming, you guys kind of were that, I just realized, wow, it's like not a power play, but it's like a powerful reclaiming of ourselves, right? As people who are between two countries and two generations, or multiple countries, multiple cultures, and multiple generations. Okay, that's my
Yeah, I mean, it's an
soapbox.
exciting time for the Asian American Canadian canon right now, where there's just so many types of works that are out there. I think with my memoir, I had some Vietnamese and I would italicize the English translation because I was like, I'm gonna other you now. How does that feel? But I still would kind of like hint at what it means most of the time if that was necessary, because I need to bring all readers along, right? Like for me as an author, I got to think about the market and make sure that I have people that are with me the whole time, right? It doesn't say like I spell out some things like spirit channeling because, it's not like very common, right? But once we've just done the initial intro, great. Now we're moving forward, right? So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'll just add one thing here, which is that when something I thought was important to explain to a Western audience, I found craft ways of doing that, right? So one example is there's this memory epic called Promised Land, in which essentially an immigrant in America has to run this virtual marathon through the desert to test kind of his resilience. And that's inspired from a standardized test in China called the Gaokao, right? And every single person in China will know the importance of the Gaokao, right? It's so intense that there are stories of parents bringing slingshots to the testing centers to hit birds in case the birds chirp and like bother the kids. The construction and roads and all of that is all shut down around testing centers around these couple of days because this test is so important. And I know people who are 5 years old, 6-year-old who are preparing for this test as early as that time. I would never have to explain that to someone from China, but for a Western audience, and it was such a big part of the story that I found a way to do that via this African American best friend who plays a critical role in that story. So when something gets to that importance, I do make sure that there is a natural mechanism to explain that, because I do think there are elements of the culture that are so interesting and important to the story, and we have to find a way to do that, just like you said.
Yeah,
Susan.
I mean, I'm Vietnamese American. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. That sounds interesting. Like, I want to know that level of pressure, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so
and just like,
yeah.
sorry, as an aside on this particular story, I love that without giving like too much away, I mean that this test has essentially been stripped of all like in this futuristic world, it's been stripped of all the kind of like learning, and I feel like has been boiled down to maybe like this is, I don't know if you meant for it to be a message, but it just becomes like a test of endurance, right? That's pure endurance. Like it's running an Ironman now virtually, right? I mean, that's what it is. And I felt like that was also, there are these moments in the book where I feel like because you took this book in kind of a futuristic sci-fi direction, you're able to say these things that are a little like removed from reality, right? But maybe kind of get to the essence of things or like give a different perspective. So those were some of the moments I really appreciated in the book where I'm like, oh yeah, like, yeah, you kind of can take a whole new perspective because of the setting you chose for the story.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's like that quote from like Ursula Le Guin about science fiction not necessarily being predictive, but rather descriptive of where we're at. And it just allows me to kind of shift the ground a little bit to see the world in a different way. And I started writing this before ChatGPT was launched, right? But I think the inspiration for that idea was actually from my time working in education and working with schools in Africa, but looking at the fact we were focusing on these 21st century skills. And they usually had nothing to do with knowledge. They were things like resilience, or actually working with computers, or so on. And it is a question going forward, like what will we value in education in a world where AI can retrieve knowledge for us, right? But when I started writing the book, that wasn't necessarily what was top of my mind.
So I want to dive into the world of the novel itself more. So you mentioned to me that memories are currency. And is it that the government knows all your memories?
I think in some way, I think it's not like most of the stories focus on the characters, and in each story tells its, has its own narrative and thread. And then the rules of the world are actually kind of implicit and kind of shared as you go throughout the book. So I think a lot of what I'm saying is probably more implicit rather than explicit. But at the beginning of the book, there is a strong sense that the government has access to surveil your memories, right? So just like you can buy or sell things in real life, the police can come in and check. Or if you buy or things online, the government can potentially also check your data and see what you're doing as well. So I think it's just a logical extreme of that in a world where if memories could actually be shared and bought and sold.
I sense you're kind of guy who doesn't accept all cookies on websites.
Yeah. They make it really hard sometimes not
hard. Or when you're on a phone, All right. So as you were working on this piece, how did the work surprise you?
to. I think for me, voice is the craft element that matters most to me. So with every one of the 11 memories, and a lot of them again are drawn from my own life and career, but for every single one, I had to hear a distinct voice. And I kind of saw each of these memory epics, and they're not chronologically ordered, they're actually really mixed up. But I had to first figure out what note they were actually ringing and whether it was different and exciting enough to pursue. And only then could I actually go down if I could follow that voice, and the story would emerge from there. I think the themes that I had intended for the book were consistent. And I don't know whether, it's the same case for you, Susan, but I found the same themes often coming up unintentionally as well as you're writing. You're like, oh, all of this was inside me all along and kind of clawing and trying to get out. And they would reappear in stories. But then after the stories came out, I then had to figure out what was the right order, what was the way in which I would tell the story, what made up a novel. Could I call it a novel? And I think there's a reason why in everywhere, in all the media, I make it very clear it's not a traditional novel, but rather what I call a constellation.
I mean, when you were working on this, did you think, oh, this is just a giant Google Doc and I'm bored during the pandemic? Or you're like, no, I've always wanted to write a novel and this is my opus?
No, it was not a Google Doc. I think when I talk about the pandemic, it wasn't the pandemic that actually started things. Like before then, I met Daniel Tan Claiborne actually at the Warren Wilson MFA program. And I started that actually in January 2020, just before the pandemic really locked everything down. And why I bring up the pandemic is that I actually had this comforting thought in the early days, which is that no matter what happened, we would all have our memories, right? Whether you were rich or poor, no matter where you were isolating, what your race was, we had our lived experiences. We could go back to them, even if we were in a small room. But then this other thought, something much more chilling came into my head, which is what if memories weren't even safe? And I think that gave me the container to imagine writing this whole book, because I knew that with what I was interested in, the breadth was going to be too large to imagine writing one book and then follow that narrative throughout. I knew I wanted to explore many different things. And I also was really, really curious about whether I could use, especially Storm of Yangtze, the story that had won that Guardian Prize, whether that could be an artifact in this book that I wanted to write. And so I became very intentional about it. And I think that gave me the container, this idea of memories being so different for everyone, and this world in which I didn't have to hold back because I could imagine the Qin Empire taking over. Those two things gave me permission to actually start writing and listening and creating these stories that became these memories did not belong to us.
So were you doing this as like a side thing with like a corporate job or like full-time thing or?
I intended to do it as a side thing with a corporate job. At the time, so just going back a little bit, when I was doing my MBA, I entered Stanford thinking I was going to work in ed tech because I had been doing education work before, and I wanted to do something with a strong social mission. I met my now wife just a few months before I was about to leave the UK. And for various reasons, it's hard for her to work in the US. And so I was looking at careers potentially that were a bit more flexible, that didn't necessarily have to be in the US. And I also thought as I was started to write during that year away, maybe I could work with writers, right? Because I still didn't see myself in that vein. And so I found this publishing fellowship through Bertelsmann, which is the conglomerate that owns Penguin Random House, and was fortunate to be in that program. And the CEO of Penguin Random House now actually came through this business fellowship program. Nihar. But I then, after graduating Stanford, I actually had these rotations in Bertelsmann subsidiaries in Berlin, then New York. And then I was the first person to go to Toronto with Penguin Random House Canada. And I was negotiating a way to stay. I was working with the CEO and the COO there on business projects. And I thought maybe I could do something part-time while doing my remote MFA. So just to clarify, what I did at Warren Wilson was called a low residency MFA. And what that means is that you spend about 10 days every 6 months in a semester on campus. You have lectures, you have workshops, etc. But most of the time, you're actually working one-on-one with an established writer. And so you're exchanging letters every 3 weeks, packets of creative work. So I thought I could do that with work. And I thought that was more representative of what a writing life might look like for me going forward. But just as my contract was coming up, COVID happened, and we extended my contract a bunch of times. And I just decided at some point the pandemic was going to lift and I could go back to my life afterwards. But then in the meantime, I was going to focus on this manuscript. And so I've always worked in sprints, always worked with pursuing my different obsessions. And so most of the book was written that way. There was 1 year after I finished the first draft of the book in which I worked in tech and was the chief of staff at a couple of unicorn tech companies. But I actually ended up following my wife to Japan, where she had a research fellowship, and I finished my novel and MFA in the same semester while living in Tokyo, and went out to agents about a month before my graduation and signed with my agents like around the time of graduation and sold the book a few months later. So.
Wow. And it was a 7-year journey, right? From start to finish?
It's 7 years from the time that the first story was published, and then 5 years from the pandemic time. It's surreal. You're catching me the day after my book launch, and I can actually, hold it actually in my hand and stuff.
You birthed it. You birthed it.
Yeah.
And earlier you were hinting about your parents and what they think about your path. Is there more you can divulge there?
Yeah, I think my parents for a long time thought it was a hobby. Right? And I guess when it started, it was just something I was interested in. I literally took a Fiction 101 class at the University of Toronto Continuing Education Studies. And and they thought I was going to stay and live and work in the US. And again, I spent more than a decade of my life in the US. It really is my second home. Most of my literary community is in the US. I did 2 degrees in the US, all of that. But they always thought I'd go back there and work in business. And somewhere along the way during COVID, they realized that this book was something more serious than they imagined. And I feel grateful that I think they trust me. They trust that I know what I'm doing with my life, probably more than I really do. But I think they also see how hard it's been for me. I think to jump from a completely different career into a different world, different culture, people communicate in different ways, people value different things. That was really, really challenging. And there's so much uncertainty with a book, which I think, Susan, you must understand, firsthand as well. You're giving, this podcast says, model minority mom. This is almost like a child I've been holding in for years, working on, and finally it's going out into the world and I can't control it anymore. And so I think they see the toll that has on me, because they've always taught me to value success, to value succeeding at what you work on. And with this, I have no idea if the book will find its readers. And I feel really lucky. I think, there's a lot of people there's a lot of great indications, great press coverage, early reviews, all of that. But I can't control that. And I have to let this book stand on its own.
Yeah, you can only do so much. And I remember before I had my pub day, they were like, Susan, your book is going to be a teenager with its own friends. I was like, no, I'm going to shepherd it to every single play date. And it's like, it has happened. It's been a good year now, and it's making its own friends, or it's finding a home in places I thought maybe, but I can see where it actually has real roots, that some surprising, some not, right? So welcome to that adventure, right? You've done everything that you can, and then it is this strange form of letting go to see where it will go. Yeah.
Well, I have a kind of a final question that's more directly related to the book on that front, which is, now the book is out. I know it's only been 1 day since it's been published, but I'm sure more people have read it now. More and more people are reading it, and hopefully many more. But in terms of early kind of reactions to the book, is there anything that's surprising to you where you're just like, that's not what that's not a theme that I had in mind, but maybe other people are seeing this, or just different reactions that you feel like you're surprised by, or even for yourself, once having written it, you're just like, oh, looking back, this is something that came out that I wasn't intending to in the beginning. So both from you and from others.
Yeah, I think I would say early on, one feedback that was coming back, which I was really surprised on, was certain visual elements that were really striking to readers. And especially, there's one in the story that's related to the chrysanthemum on the cover. There's one particular image of a body and flowers sprouting from the body that folks bring up a lot. And I think that's interesting because my memory is really unique. I have this rare condition. I test very close to this condition known as aphantasia, where I actually cannot see almost anything in my visual memories. Like if I recall a past event, I'll remember what happened. I'll remember the narrative, and that's why language and listening matter so much to me. And also what I felt in that moment, but I can't actually always see it. And so I'm very careful about what I put in, about what people notice and what people don't notice, because so often in my life, I fail to notice things too. But I do make sure to be very careful, be very thoughtful about the visual elements. So that's one thing that was a pleasant surprise early on. And then the other piece of it, I think it's still early, but I'm just taking it all in. I think I've been really, really grateful for the reaction so far. I think there was always a question for me, and there was a review from the Straits Times that came out that was very positive, but they did read into it probably a bit more politically than I intended. And I think that's why in interviews, I've always been really, really careful about saying that I did not write this book as some kind of critique against China, against my birth country. It was just that recontextualizing of the world that I had mentioned earlier, and that way for me to feel free as I was writing. But it was interesting in that review, which again was very positive in general, and I'll have a great pull quote from it, as you know, Susan, from the reviews. But they even brought up issues about, political issues and Chinese philosophies going on today, like lying flat and so on, that I didn't really intend when I was writing this book. And I'm sure there'll be plenty more of that. And I think in many ways it's about letting go and only stepping in when you really need to.
All right, Kate, I think you had one last question maybe before we round out with inside thoughts.
Yeah. So Yiming, I want to talk about and also ask you about your thoughts about this transition where you mentioned that, you had this other career and then, you came into this writing, but it's not what defines you necessarily even yet in your own estimation of yourself, because you still have a foot in this like other career world. And I think it reminded me a lot about what I personally am thinking about in my middle age. We all turned 40 this past year. And that I've been talking about with other Asian American friends who have had more of a typical career up to this time, which Susan also had and Jeanette also had, which is that even though we are very accomplished at our typical careers, when it comes to stepping outside of that, there is this, for example, I feel like this kind of imposter syndrome, and Susan Jeanette knows I'm working through the artist's way, which Yiming, I don't know if you've done that. Probably many people have.
I haven't done it, but I've known many people who have.
Yeah, which is for audience members. The Artist's Way is a book by Julia Cameron, and it helps you tap into your creative self, right? I think for Asian America, us being raised as Asian Americans, the creative self was never acknowledged as a real self. And I think for all of us, if we look back on our childhood, I mean, I like Yiming, I think I resonate so strongly with your recounting of childhood, which is that I was always the math and science person, which my husband, by the way, recently found. He was like, "What, you were?" Because my later personality was this much more different personality. But I think that was a cloak that we all had to don, because that was what Asian immigrant parents approved of, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that now that I'm thinking about articulating in it as I turn 40, and many people are, I think, there is this certain fear and of this imposter syndrome that we might feel about, well, I guess I'm like smart, but I don't know if I can really do this. Or, for example, for you said you were very artist adjacent. I think they call it the shadow artist. Susan, right? Is that in the Artist's Way? Like, and my friend recently called me a shadow artist as well. And so I guess like my question to you, and you can answer or commentary, is just what would you advise people who are kind of going through this right now? Somebody like myself, or I think many of our other peers who have had a successful conventional career, but now that they're reaching an age at which they're reflecting, but they're kind of afraid to touch that part of themselves that was always there, but was like, ignored by themselves and their family. Yeah, what's your advice for that? Because I feel like you've kind of made a breakthrough in that way, and I think sharing that perspective would be really helpful. Sorry, I know it doesn't sound very clear what I'm trying to articulate, because I think I'm still trying to work through it myself, but I feel like you kind of know what I'm talking about because you've been there.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of advice I've received when thinking about whether to start a family. So there's no perfect time, right? I think so often people delay gratification or defer their dreams thinking that they'll get to it. And it rarely works out that way, right? And look, I still don't know whether what I did is the right decision. I wrote this book during a pivotal period of my life that I probably would have made a lot of even more progress in my professional business career, especially during this time when so many technologies have changed. But I'm not sure I would have written this book if I didn't go the time that I did. It was advice that I had received when I was actually at Stanford, and because writing a book is very much like being a one-man startup for a long time. And even when you get a team, Susan, you know how much of the onus to make the book successful is on the author. Today, more than ever. Yeah, I was at Stanford, a lot of people don't take full-time jobs coming out of it. And I think it's because they have the privilege of having gone to good school, and they can get back into it later on. But it's because if you don't do it now, you may never do it. And it's because later on, your opportunity cost will only increase over time.
Mortgage,
right.
kids, responsibilities, taking care of your parents.
Yeah. I have chills thinking about all of that as you speak. So I made that decision to jump in and write these memories do not belong to us rather than waiting 5 or 10 years. And I think all you can do is to take the right next step and adapt. I think so much of it and so much of what's stopping you is actually fear, right? And there's often nothing the best way to address that fear often is to just take that little step forward and then adapt to what comes, right? And again, it's so much easier said than done. And I'm here with you, but as a writer, Susan, I'm sure you've received this too. We also get contacted by people all the time from folks with our backgrounds. How did you write this book? What should I do? All of that stuff. I've had, and I've been, fairly careful about these things, but over the years, the amount of people who've actually gone all the way, very few, right? I think it takes so much to get there. It's also harder than people realize, right? For writing in particular, because people think we went to high school, we row, I write stories, I publish whatever. It's another level because the barriers to entry are so low, right? There's like essentially none and even fewer. So I think people don't realize how hard it is and they give up along the way. But I think it's the step one is just embrace that fear, know that it's there, and take things one step at a time, knowing that with every year that passes, the opportunity cost only goes up.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff Bezos says, was it him? I think he said he lives by a regret minimization function. So
Yeah,
it's just so. Like, okay, cool. What's going to create or result in the least regret, right? Like, and for me, I try to live like I'm mortal. If I'm going to die in 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, 1 day, what am I going to do? Because it is true. We could spend time, right? Like, but we live like we won't. We live like we're immortal. So, I mean, and it's crazy because it's not just the craft, it's the business, it's the parental expectations, it's the own self-judgment, thinking like, I did all this schooling somewhere else or all this training somewhere else, like sunk costs, right? Like I should go back. I don't want to lose what I already sunk my time into. But then really it's like, well, what am I scared that I will regret on my deathbed?
You also have to be willing to embrace the fact that it will probably be bad.
Yeah.
Before you can get
Yeah.
good. It's just like you went to school for something else where you might have gotten a PhD like my wife did. Just because you enjoyed something doesn't mean you're at that level. You have to train, you have to work and put in that time and investment. And I think, those are things that people don't always realize at the beginning, but it's part of maturity in some ways, right? Like it's not exactly related to the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it's like you often don't know what you don't know until you get into something. And it's often the people who know more that know where they're weaker, where they're deficient, versus someone who's just, hasn't even started the process.
I think one of my biggest challenges with writing was just like confronting my perfectionism and my overachievement. Like where I'm like, if I'm not successful or if my first draft isn't amazing, I suck, and it's like, how do I come back to the beginner's mind? How do I come back with curiosity? Like, the structure's all messed up. We're never going to get there. Oh, cool. How else could I structure this? What's another way I could do? What if I place this here? Like to come in with that energy that's a little bit more curious and hopeful instead of just like doomed, because I have doom voice all the time, right? And I think that was really helpful was when I finally accepted, like, I have failed. Great. All there is now is up.
Yeah. And if we weren't talking about writing, I think, honestly, it would be a much more pleasant journey to explore another passion and so on. I think it's actually one of the downsides, I think, of this field that we've chosen is that people only rarely read your stuff twice. Like if you're going to an agent or you're going to an editor, nobody will touch you if they don't like the first 5 or 10 pages or so on. And that actually accentuates the kind of perfectionism dilemma that it sounds like both of us really struggle with, and probably a lot of people from our backgrounds. And I think that actually holds us back. And I think it would actually be easier potentially in certain other fields where people are willing to like listen to a song multiple times, for instance, right, and see how it evolves. it's very hard to get that attention, I think, from like professional readers in the industry.
I mean, we didn't even talk about the business model, man. You know, like, oh, you get some advance. Maybe it's livable. Most of the time, it's not based on the number of hours you input into this project. And then you just kind of sit around and wait. And you can promote as much as you can in all different mediums. And then you just hope. But guess what? It takes people a long time to read a book. My TBR list is way too long of books that I've heard of over the years many, many times. And it's like, and then that author is over there just being like, maybe one day I'll make 10 cents, you know? Like, all right. Well, oh my gosh, it's been such a joy to talk to you about your work. I'm so excited for you. Congratulations. You did the thing. You've done the thing. And now it's up to the world to and to read your book. These memories do not belong to us. So usually we wrap up our episode with an insight thought, which is a question that I've had the whole time. And we have been talking about escapist literature or sci-fi. And I'm just so curious, what are you guys all doing to escape? Escape the world that we live in today? What do you give yourself? I have to tell you, I just got this book. My friend gave it to me. It was like Divorce Yourself from Your Phone. Because I think I have a codependent relationship with my phone. So I realized the best places where I am escaping is where there was water. I know like you can put iPhones in water, but I've never tried. I'm not going to do it. But I love going to hot springs because like, you know, you have a locker, you know, like you can't be that like person like on your phone. But I just need forced situations where there's like no Wi-Fi. I'm sorry, ma'am, there's no Wi-Fi. You know, there's no nothing. And then I'd be like, oh, okay. And then that's when I feel I can actually escape to the present moment. Like that's where I'm actually escaping to, is because all the time I'm always living in like productivity and like planning and worrying. And so for me, that's what I do to escape. And someone was just telling me about a new hot springs in Washington State. So I'm excited to do that when, you know, my child is grown up in 15 years. What about you all? What do you do to escape?
Well, Susan and Jeanette know this because I told them, but this winter we're planting our family, me and my husband are taking our 2 kids to Bangkok, and we're going to be based out of there for 2.5 months because the kids are still young. They're 3 and 5. So, you know, school, whatever. And it's escapism for me because, so we did a trial run earlier this year for 3 weeks. And I realized what I really liked about that, which is a form of escapism, is that I didn't have to worry about cleaning the house. We lived in a serviced apartment in Bangkok, which is very affordable because, you know, low cost. I didn't have to worry about like organizing social arrangements, like all the things which predominantly fall on, you know, mom, right? Well, you don't know yet that quite yet, Yiming, but you may in the future. I just didn't have that. I got to escape from that for 3 weeks. And yeah, the kids were around, but I found that I had more patience for the kids. I enjoyed being around them more because I wasn't constantly being like, oh, okay, well, I got to do like this, plan for that, like go pick them up and do this. You know, that was my escapism. So this winter, where I'm going to have 2.5 months of escapism from real life, AKA like everyday obligations by living in my service apartment in Bangkok with they clean twice a day, guys. Okay.
Why?
Like once in the morning and then once in the evening. I literally don't have yes, it's great. But I also think, you know, just piggybacking on even what you were saying toward the end is that I think that's time I'm going to use is for me. That escapism I'm going to use to finally just really go into my writing and that exploration. So yeah, that's my form of escapism as a mom, you know, because I know it's really hard to do that once you have kids.
I'm like escapism. I'm like that's so broad. I mean, it can mean like vacation. It can mean like, you know, I
I
mean,
know. That's why I asked it.
But y'all know vacation with kids isn't real
Oh,
vacation,
no.
okay? That's not
Oh,
escapism.
no.
yeah.
No.
I think one thing that I've been doing more lately that kind of feel like I'm like, okay, you know, I'm doing just something different. I'm kind of disconnected from the everyday grind is I've been getting back into dance lessons. So I was a dancer like most of my teenage and young adult years, and I'm getting back into it and I just love it. Like I just love being there, getting exercise. It's a chance for me to be like, it's like a form of self-expression that I really love. And I think I just appreciate it now in a way that I didn't appreciate it in my younger years. I think there was like a point where I'm like, should I do this more seriously or not? But now, obviously, that's not really something I'm thinking about, but it's also just something that I really enjoy. And it sounds really weird and almost like, I mean, it might sound trivial or metaphysical, like depending on how you look at it. But I think in this stage of life, I actually really value the things that I know that I enjoy because life is very much a grind. And so just knowing that I have things that still bring me joy and are unencumbered or feel more precious to me, like my hobbies, these types of things. And so, of course, my body is still getting used to this. I feel like after like an hour and a half lesson, I feel so terrible that after the first lesson, I actually had to walk straight across the street from the studio into a 7-Eleven. And I had to ask if they had like those single packets of Advil, which they did not. So I had to plunk down $12 for a full bottle of Advil, even though I had a giant bottle at home because I knew I just had to have one right then because my back was just killing me. And no, I think dance for me, I don't know if I would say escapism, but it's like a time when I'm like not looking at my phone. I'm not, my kids are typically with my husband or a sitter, so I'm not really worried about them. And it's just an hour and a half where I feel great coming out of it. And I really enjoyed that time.
Yeah. Gotta pop.
That's
I can't
wonderful.
believe, and you probably had that big Costco bottle too, right? And you're like, oh, I have to buy the small ones. at
Oh yeah,
regular
like
price.
it just felt like my back. It's like am experiencing things with my body that I feel I never experienced before. Like when I was a dancer in my 20s, like I used to come in back from break and then the instructor would be like, "Oh, take it easy. You're just easing yourself back." And I'm like, "What is that?" I'm just going full on, like didn't even know what she was talking about. But now I'm like, "Oh, I understand. I do have to take it easy and ease into it because my body is telling me you are no longer 20 years old."
This is true. How about you, Ming? What
Yeah.
about you? Escapism.
Well, I guess I'll piggyback on what both you and Jeanette said around something related to this, which is, I guess, hot springs and hot water. I mean, by the way, I did not know there were hot springs near Washington State. So when I visit Seattle, maybe on the book tour, maybe there'll be a chance for that. But I even wrote an essay, actually, in preparation for this book launch related to this. And I think it's one thing I really, really love are not just like the onsens of Japan, which are beautiful and natural spring water where people go and relax and people bring their families and stuff too. And they're often in beautiful parts near mountains in Japan. But just the local bathhouses in the major cities, because, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people didn't have bathing facilities. And one thing I always escaped to when I was writing this book, when I was wrapping up the book, was going like maybe 3 times a week or more to actually these sentos, right? These local bathhouses where it's mostly elderly people who are there. The water is not natural spring water. It's just heated tap water. But there are these baths and everyone's scrubbing intensely. And all you hear is the rush of water. But nobody talks to each other, partly because it's Japanese, partly because we're all naked and all of that. And I loved it. And I just loved, there was a period that, just like what you said, Susan, our phones are away in our lockers. It's this whole new world, and you can just be there and just be who you are. You can think if you want to, you can not think if you don't want to. And it's an experience I always cherish because I brought my groomsmen there too for my second wedding. And it was really, really funny to see their expressions the first time we all had to go into this space. I warned them, it was like all going to be old men in this bathhouse. And they loved it. And honestly, I've been still looking for that equivalent, whenever I've been in the West. Like some condos have hot tubs and all of that, but it's just not quite the
Oh,
same.
no.
And people are looking at their phones as well
they're
often.
talking about nothing. Oh,
that too, yeah.
I do not care. Do not care.
Yeah,
I remember
yeah.
one bathhouse in Japan, and it was like electrocuted water or something. And I was like, what? And I was like, and then went in to electrocute myself. I don't even know what I was doing. Seems dangerous.
Yeah. The translations are hilarious. Like I've been in, it's just like herbal bath and it's just brown. And you're like, I have no idea what's in here. But it's just, yeah, it's something I'm still, it's funny because with the book, I feel like I haven't really had the chance to escape as much. And this is actually the next 2 weeks before I go on book tour in the States. That's actually when I'm like actually eagerly looking for ways to escape before the
Oh,
next.
well, you should try to find some Korean-run bathhouses because I feel like those are the closest. Like, I don't know if
Yeah.
other ethnicities also run bathhouses in the US. Like, to my knowledge, only it's like a Korean American thing.
Russian and Russian.
Maybe Russians,
Yeah, like European,
Yeah.
Eastern
Nordic.
Europeans. But yes, actually, here in Seattle, we have a couple of Korean-run bathhouses, and they're like pretty comparable, but not as large as the bathhouses run in Korea.
I love it. No, thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, Yiming, congratulations on your book. Everyone, please get the book. These memories do not belong to us wherever you get your books. And of course, give him 5 stars. You can follow Yiming at Yiming Writes on Instagram. And Yiming, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for Model Minority Moms.
We hope you found something helpful, reassuring, or interesting in this episode of Model Minority Moms. If you enjoyed the episode, please help us spread the word by texting a friend about our show or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to connect with us, please visit our website at modelminoritymoms.com or follow us on Instagram, where we love receiving messages from our listeners.